You've heard AM, you've heard FM. Now, tune into DM Radio, the world's longest running show about data. Each week, host Eric Kavanaugh interviews the brightest minds in the world of information management. Want to be on a show? Send an email to info@dmradio.biz. Now, here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
Hello and welcome back once again to the longest running show in the world about data. It's called DM Radio. Yours truly, Eric Kavanaugh here. And I'm very excited today to have an all-star cast of data experts. We've got practitioners, we've got technologists, we have analysts on the show today. So it's going to be a nice round view of the world of data. And we're going to talk about one of the absolute hottest topics in data these days. It's a concept called data fabric. And in particular, a nice new spin on that, the logical data fabric. So what does that mean? Why should you care? That's what we'll talk about today. So we're going to hear from Christopher G. of Ultra Mobile, also Mint Mobile, owned by Ryan Reynolds, the movie star. Look at that guy go. He's hilarious. I love him. We've got Ravi Shankar of Denodo Technologies on, and also Sanjeev Mohan, relatively new in the independent analyst world. He's a former Gartner analyst. Now he's out there doing his own thing. One of the hardest working men I've encountered in the world of data. So he's going to share some insights that he's got as well. But first, I'll just give you an opening statement on what we mean by data fabric. So most people understand that there's a database that holds their data. And the database gets accessed when you're running your systems, whether it's some commercial transaction or some interesting other use case around maybe trying to understand a new market, doing some research, something along those lines. The point is people know that it's in a database somewhere. Well, databases have evolved tremendously in the last 10 years. I mean, there's been an absolute explosion of database types, of open source databases. We have lots of different kinds of databases these days, fit for purpose. You had companies like Facebook building their own, rolling their own database, Cassandra. You have a lot of open source technologies that are just taking over. So it used to be Oracle, IBM, SAP had some database technology and SAP Sybase, for example. But no longer is it going to be that you just choose a database. Now, especially for large enterprises or at least data intensive organizations, you need to have some other solution that does not just rely on one database. So that's where the concept of data fabric comes into play. And then there's a sort of theory and a methodology around data mesh, which is kind of interesting. And I'm still trying to wrap my head around exactly how that works. But it's designed to optimize domain-specific information sets and use cases where you don't just sort of generalize data across the entire organization. You understand that the marketing people have a different use case than the sales people, than the R&D people, et cetera. How do you manage all that data? How do you compute that data efficiently in order to generate insights that can add value? Well, these are all sort of hard knock life type experiences in the world of data. And we've learned a lot over the years about what breaks, how to fix things, where the slowness is, where is the latency coming from? What about concurrency? There are all these different issues that come into play when you're talking about getting access to data. And it doesn't take a data scientist to figure out that when you have web scale information everywhere, think like ad tech networks and things of that nature. Think telco. We're going to hear from Christopher G. from Mint Mobile. Telcos, telecommunication companies have shocking amounts of data. I mean, just unbelievable amounts of data because they have to, because they're connecting all these phone calls. There's all this metadata you want to be able to analyze and understand to improve throughput, to improve issues like dropped calls, for example. So, if you want to be applying artificial intelligence and machine learning on your data sets to be able to find these optimal solutions for improving call drops, for example, for getting less of them, well, guess what? You have to have some meaningful way of accessing vast amounts of data and then being able to process it and do things with it. And that's why data fabric and data mesh are topics today. So with that, let's bring in Christopher G. from Mint Mobile. I love that Ryan Reynolds owns this thing. Tell us a bit about your background and how you use data to improve your organization.
Sure. Thanks, Eric. Thanks for the intro again. So our organization has been using Denodo for about 5 years and change and continue going on. And we started with, we start from the beginning. We started with, traditional data warehousing, and you would develop, build, persist data and do reporting. Well, we're moving into more of a modern world where data virtualization is absolutely needed, where we have cloud We have hybrid microservices, increase of data silos. Without virtualizing and building a logical data warehouse, how do you build that fast enough? So what we try to do is we think about building things that are purpose-built to solve business problems in the concept of how do we POC and build things quickly so we don't have to persist everything. Some things never get persisted at all. That's why it's a logical data warehouse. So that's what we've done with the modern stack. But now we were talking about data fabricing. Well, we're moving even further from a data fabricing perspective to where that was more modern. Our first use case was we built virtualization. We did reporting off the virtualized data set. That's fine and dandy. That's great. But we expanded further. We are fabricating over majority of all of our data. This allows us to govern our self-service single point of data, single view of data. We can certify now our data through this fabric of information. People can trust the data. We only certify what's needed. We have gone further where, when I mentioned we were doing it for reporting, we're actually building more and more with our data. We're treating it as a service. So our data is a service now. It's powering our operational systems in a lot of cases. So what this has done now by building integrations and being able to integrate with our systems, we've actually moved into a tier 1 application support, if you think about it that way, right? Traditional databases, warehousing, you're building reporting and analytics, and maybe some data science. We exposed our data, integrating with our operational systems. So we're now a T1 application now in support of those with this data fabric here. So I'll pause there if you have any questions there, Eric. So
that's a lot of great information, and you're kind of hinting at data as a service and data products, right? And that I think that represents a rather significant maturation in the marketplace. So we're not just using bits and pieces of data. Companies are creating data products that are then used by the organization to optimize sales, to optimize marketing, to optimize, well, really the network itself, which, as you know, in a telco world is an incredibly complex thing, right? So the more meaningful analysis you can glean from this machine data that's flying all around everywhere, the more your people can focus on solving this problem or that problem and just kind of working through the order of business as it comes up, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned earlier that in the telco industry, we have vast amounts of data. Every single interaction a specific person makes with a mobile device is recorded and captured. Wow. Imagine the volume multiplied by the varieties of ways you interact. Is it a call? Is it a text? What is it? Are you using broadband data on your phone? What is it? And then every single one of those gets recorded for all our subscribers. That volume of data is massive. And we've leveraged Denodo in an interesting use case to where you have traditional two-factor authentication. You may say, well, I'm 2FAing when I'm calling to maybe the call center saying, I'm identifying who I am. Pretty easy to social engineer around it. Maybe not. We've integrated one more layer of authentication. When you call in, we will ask you for your most recent activities, call, text, whatever it is. It's pretty hard to hack that. And imagine how much data is underneath that to be able to have that in near real time. Yeah. We have done all that with the data fabric, and it integrates with our customer care systems that are servicing our customers 24/7. It's a powerful use case there. Pretty crazy too.
Yeah, and I'm guessing that part of the magic here is that if you go with the traditional route, what you have are a lot of point-to-point connections, and that's okay for those particular use cases for those particular people. But a whole array of point-to-point connections winds up being very hard to manage, being very hard to even understand, and it has a significant impact on performance, right? Everyone understands the experience of going to some retail shop and they're like clicking on something. Oh, our systems are slow today, for example. Well, is it the system that's slow, or is it the network? Is it the database? A lot of times it is the database that is the holdup. And there are locking issues. There are lots of reasons why there are troubles with databases doing what they're supposed to do, even though they're amazing these days, there's no doubt. But still, with the data fabric, you take a much more comprehensive approach to data provisioning. And I wanted to mention at the top of the show, with respect to data virtualization, I think a lot of people are familiar with VMware, and that was virtualization of your hardware, of your servers, basically. Because what was happening is, even with the best brains in the business, you had machines running companies where the CPU usage was like at 20% or 10% or something. And so people did the math. They realized, wait a minute, we're only getting 10 to 20% of the value of this big honking box that we bought, right? So we saw virtualization take over, and VMware just skyrocketed, obviously, on the compute side for like applications and things in your hardware. And now, of course, it was probably 10, 11 years ago that data virtualization started in this industry, and it's really come a long way. I think we're at a sort of 2.0 period of time with data virtualization, and that is what Data Fabric boils down to. Is that about right?
Sounds about right to me.
Yeah, well, we have an expert who can comment on that. Sanjeev Mohan is out there. He's been tracking this industry for quite a long time. Sanjeev, what do you think about the significance of Data Fabric as a new approach, not just conceptual, but physical, logical, et cetera? What do you think about that?
So thanks, Eric. I feel this is the right approach in the current times that we live in. And what do I mean by current times? We have an explosion of not just data, but products, technologies, approaches, patterns. And every day, the buyers are bombarded with, here, look at my data catalog, look at my data integration piece, look at this product, look at that product. There's just too many products in every category that I cover. There are literally scores of products that are not very easy to differentiate, at least at a high level. Mm-hmm. So that is one market force. The second market force that we have is we don't have enough talent in the market that knows these products and can integrate them together. So in this scenario, we need a logical data fabric. We need a data fabric. So let me not go to logical right now. Let me just say we need a data fabric which has sort of stitched together some of these moving parts so the end users don't have to stitch it together. That avoids the end user from getting multiple technologies, finding the right skills, paying for the integration overhead and cost, and then having to govern, manage, audit, log, and do all of that administration and operational pieces. So that is why we see data fabrics as a very attractive way of an integrated, comprehensive, unified solution. Mm-hmm. So that's a major thing. Now let's talk about logical. So what is logical and what's physical? So in the realm of physical, we would make copies of data and move it around. We tried decades ago to have a single enterprise corporate data warehouse, and we didn't succeed. There is no such thing as one single source of truth and everything the company needs, you will find in there. In fact, today, it amazes me when I talk to the clients, they have literally dozens and dozens, sometimes about 100 SaaS applications that they're getting data from. So you're not going to move everything to one place. Moving everything to one place also means we are replicating data, duplicating data. Now we may have this bifurcation of which is the right single source of truth. So logical data fabric comes around and it says, let's try to minimize data movement, mm-hmm. which interestingly, even GDPR has a data minimization component. So if we can minimize data movement, and I know the data is governed in the source, I don't have to create a new copy of that data and now I have to govern it. So data virtualization allows us, and that is a logical part, where we can leave the data in its original source, but have an optimized engine that can federate the data from different places and provide the end users with their results. The end users don't really care where this data is coming from and what format it's in. They're business users. They want to run their business logic. So for them, they get a nice semantic layer that shows them the business definition, the business concept, the data fabric behind the scenes, stitches together the requests that are being made and knows where to go to bring the data and bring it all together and give it to the consumer.
Right. Well, there's a lot of stuff that goes into this too. Intelligent caching, for example, predictive modeling or predictive algorithms that can recognize patterns. Okay, at the beginning of the month, at the end of the month, when people are running reports, for example, we know there's going to be a spike in queries, and they're probably going to use all these different data sets. Let's go ahead and grab that and cache it and have it at the ready for when these people start hitting it. So these are what some of the more intelligent systems do these days, right, Sanjeev, is they recognize behavioral patterns and they cater to that, and they try to anticipate peaks of usage to be able to solve those problems when they need to be solved. So you don't get, because concurrency has always been an issue, right? 50, 80, 150 analysts all ping in the same database. That's where a lot of these systems have fallen down traditionally. And Data Fabric, one of the things it's helping solve is that particular problem, right?
Yes, a great point. The data virtualization or federation is not a new concept. What is new is this amount of, call it ML based, or I don't want to overhype, everybody's saying, oh, machine learning enabled this and that. But the point is that the newer, more modern solutions have more intelligent optimizations, which includes caching. So if we know that some data, so let me give you a simple example. If I'm going to select, and Christopher, feel free to jump in. You live this life every day. If I am going to jump in and do a query that joins, let's say, my data from SAP with some historical data, but I need to do a lookup on some codes. Now these codes are in Excel. So I'm just giving you a real life example.
Right.
That's a very small piece of data. Why would I go look that up every single time? I can cache it.
Right.
So that's now right. I'm doing memory to memory. So I'm doing my joins in memory. When it comes to a very large database, I can do a push down. So using all kinds of different techniques and algorithms, we are trying to minimize this joining of data. Because at the end of the day, if we don't do that, then the thing with data virtualization is it is, after all, a slave of the speed of light. You cannot beat that, right? So we need to find more intelligent ways rather than just a brute force sending everything to all over the place and then trying to join it.
Yeah, right. That's right. And just for a fun little tip here as we go to our first break, you used to scale up. We talked about scaling up. So you get bigger computers and faster memory, and then you hit Moore's law. Basically, then you'd scale out with nodes. There are other issues of complexity there. But the key is you want to be able to optimize without necessarily scaling up or scaling out. And that's intelligent processing, basically. We'll be right back, folks. You're listening to DM Radio.
Welcome back to DM Radio. Here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, back here on DM Radio, talking all things data fabric today. We're going to talk about getting the data, processing the data. How do you provision your data, your information assets for this new digital economy, which has a scale that we have frankly never seen before. It's a scale that gets bigger by the day. That's why we have terms like hyperscale out there. We were talking to several experts today. We've got Christopher G. from Mint Mobile, Ravi Shankar from Denodo Technologies, and Sanjeev Mohan from Sanjmo. And Sanjeev called out to Christopher in that last segment. And Christopher, I'd love to learn from you about the richness. I came up with this term, the canvas of data that you can access is so vast and so interesting. And because you're in the consumer space, you get everyone, you get every kind of demographic, every type that's out there, and you can really learn a lot from that. And there's something cool you've done with the data fabric and a recommendation engine. Tell us about that.
Sure. Let me start with what kind of data do we have? How big is it? And what is it all about? And why do we need data fabric? So, we're teetering up to near 50 plus sources of information, of data sources, types of data. We have data sits in Salesforce. We have billing data. We have data stored in operational systems, the typical, MySQL type databases backend. We have data that's unstructured in Mongo. We have data that's sitting in cloud warehouse, Snowflake. I can go on and on and on. We have quite a bit of different sources and variety. Imagine how many silos you can build in all these different types of sources of data. Not to mention the volume of data that comes from the usage information for every single call you made. every single text you made before too. It's quite a vast amount of data. To harness all that, could you imagine persisting all that over and over again, building all of these ETL pipelines?
Oh my goodness.
Why not just fabric this data instead, logical, in a logical, meaningful way? So the use case you mentioned earlier, Eric, that we built recently is we are fabricating over our recommendations engine. So as you come to our app as an example, we will provide you a recommendation based on who you are and your profile. We'll give you multiple recommendations. And how does that work? That's different than traditional recommendations. You may just get one recommendation, and the next time you come back, and we'll recommend you something else. Well, on the fly, near real time, since we are fabricating over our clickstream data, we'll know what you're interacting with the recommendation in near real time. Wow. You come in, we recommend you something, you click, did you convert? Great, let's give the person the second recommendation. We'll go on and on. Did you sign up for something else? We'll fabric over our order information. We'll find out, did you order it actually? So it's quite an interesting use case that I wasn't quite sure I was going to work out, but we get solved for that using Denodo. Quite powerful, and I think it's a game changer for us.
Well, it is, and for lots of different reasons. Just think about attention span, right? I know myself, you start on any given day, there's all the stuff you want to get done, and then what happens? Your attention gets drawn into projects, fires you have to put out, things that happen with your family or whatever, and then the day is done, right? So the customer touch point is more important now than ever. So the more you can engage with that customer in that touch point, and to your point, to be able to make a recommendation, then note, they took the recommendation, and feed that back into an algorithm that says, if they took that, and we know this about them, offer this other thing. And if they took that, now we're building a much more enriched profile of this customer. And what does that allow for? Personalization, right? Which I think is going to be really the key to retail and commerce and lots of other industries in the coming years. Is how granular can you get in your offers to your client, to your customer, and how well can you cater to their personality, to their needs, to when, even as simple as when someone wants to do something. I get my friend, he jokes, he goes, you answered the phone at night. I learned that you only answer the phone in the morning or something. So people will notice it, but machines notice all that stuff. And so if you can leverage that, then you can optimize your ad campaigns. You can optimize every customer touch point. I mean, the value just spins out in lots of directions, right, Christopher?
Absolutely. And we're only scratching the surface with that.
I have a question.
Constantly enhancing. Yes, Sanjeev.
So Christopher, you mentioned that you have 50 different databases, all kinds of them, structured, semi-structured, unstructured. Now, you're doing this inference on the customer who logs in, and you're recommending the next best offer or whatever it is. To execute this machine learning model, it must have been trained, but the data is in all of these places. What did you use? What platform did you use to train the model? And how is it being executed inside Denodo?
Yeah, it's been trained using things like our we use things such as SageMaker in AWS. Okay, right? That's one way to train models. We'll train things in our Python platform, right? So we'll do it there. Scikit-learn as an example. We'll train it there. So different libraries. So we train it offline, and how do we execute it? We feature engineer and we build our operationalizing our entire machine learning algorithm into production, and the data gets fed in. We can feed it in near real time because we're fabricating over the data, and we repurpose the model as we need to. So
I see.
Yeah, that's a great. We have a couple of good questions from our virtual studio audience here. And folks, if you're driving down the road listening to the show and you're like, wow, how can I get into that virtual studio audience? Just hop online to dmradio.biz and register for one of these shows. And you can be actually here while we record and broadcast the show. So it's pretty fun. But attendee is asking, with data virtualization, how do you deal with historical data that is not persisted in the source system, so it's no longer there to query? Can you talk about that for a minute, Christopher?
Sure. If it's no longer a query, I think it was brought up earlier. If the data is sitting somewhere and it's no longer an online system, you can actually build it as a persisted cache, and it will be there available for you as one of your lower level base views in Denodo. So you can continue using that low level cache. It may disappear, but you've already built the cache within Denodo, and you would continue using that historical data there over and over again.
Well,
so you never refresh it. So you would keep it there, it would be part of your build every single time.
That's interesting. You know, what's interesting to me about this, and I love to talk about abstraction layers, but what you're creating, and I love the way you say we fabric this data. That's cool. You've turned it into a verb, which I love. But what you've got here is this logical data fabric becomes the marshaling area for data access and data provisioning. And it allows the business to incrementally optimize certain domains or certain use cases, certain divisions, certain departments, whoever the case may be. But the point is that you have this visual metaphor for kind of understanding where the data is coming from, where it's going, and thus you can optimize who gets what when. I mean, at the end of the day, you can't give everything to everyone all the time. So you do have to make priorities about who gets what and, you know, how much money you throw at this, how much, you know, compute power and all that kind of fun stuff. But to have the fabric is the sort of mechanism through which you understand and build all that. To me, that's pretty interesting too. But what do you think, Christopher?
I think it is interesting because when you talk about build, how much we build, and I brought that up a little bit earlier, it allows us to experiment, discover, tinker really quickly, and it's at a much lower level cost. We can bring things to market a lot faster, speed the market a lot faster. And then if we see it works from the concept of product, is that the MVP or the final product you really want to build?
Right.
Without a lot of investment in persistence. It's not to say we're never going to build things and persist and store things. We will at the right point where it serves a business purpose, but speed to market is important. This allows us to run more of an agile manner.
That's
incremental build things. Yep.
Yeah, that's very, and just to put some context in what Christopher is talking about, folks, and I'll bring in Ravi Shankar from Denodo next. When you see these offers come on your phone, like, you know, 3 months off or 50% off for this period of time, the reason you're seeing more and more of those offers is because the companies are crunching the numbers under the hood and figuring out what they can afford and what they'll be able to make money on. So how deep can you cut your pricing and still make money, but get more market share, et cetera? All of those offers that you see are data-driven. They're all insights-driven. And frankly, on another future show, and we'll talk about data products in more detail, but you're going to be seeing more and more of these data products out there, which represent a maturation in the industry to me. When you start talking about data as a data product as opposed to just a piece of data or an insight, for example, you're really starting to get somewhere. And to your point, Christopher, I'll throw it back to you one more time real quick here is, iteration is critical, especially these days. I mean, COVID sent everything sideways. All this human behavior just went in different directions that it's never really gone in before. So guess what? The more agile you were, the more nimble you were, the faster you could iterate and kind of figure out, okay, well, let's try this, let's try that. You have to try different things to see if they work. That iteration cycle delivers tremendous value if you can really compact it down to like days instead of weeks or, God forbid, months, right?
Completely agree with you. Well put about summarizing the speed and market in the current market we're in. It's about leading, not lagging. First market counts. So.
That's exactly right. And I'll bring Ravi in now to kind of give us some of the underpinnings. But the other thing I've noticed a few years ago, and it is accelerated, I guess it's logarithmic to an extent, is that the disparity between leaders in an industry and laggards in an industry grows by the day. And it'll grow so significant if you're not investing in these technologies and methods that you'll just go away. I mean, you're not going to be able to survive as a company if you're not leveraging this kind of data product. But Ravi Shankar, let's bring you in. He's been waiting patiently in the wings there. I've known Ravi for 14, 15 years, maybe, from way back in the early days of this business. So it's fun to watch it all evolve over time. But Ravi, tell us a bit about yourself and what Denodo is doing to enable this data fabric.
Yeah, so Denodo, as Chris pointed out, we have a data virtualization logical approach to data integration management and data delivery. And the data fabric is a very good concept that is being talked more about by Gartner. Sanjeev, when he was there, he talked quite a bit about it as well. And in it, data virtualization is a very core component of it. And we talk about like the data fabric as being physical and logical. The physical approach is basically the monolithic approach. And there was a paper that was published by Sumit Pal, Sanjeev, you might know him. So he actually published a paper just earlier in January. He talked about the federation of analytics engine. So he talks about how monolithic architecture is not very conducive to having for the modern data and analytics. And he says that you need to have a federated approach, which is basically the logical approach enabled by data virtualization. And that's where like the connect versus the collect principle comes. So a lot of the people have been subscribing, and we are being pretty used to from the data warehousing database days to collect the data into a single repository. But as Chris mentioned, once that crosses a particular threshold of 50 plus resources, how are you going to bring all the data into a yet another physical repository and make it all available? Right. We all understand the value of unified data as a business user. I'm a business user. And as Sanjeev mentioned, I really don't care where the data actually comes from, as long as I get my data immediately and with high quality. And let's try to do that. And the logical approach which Data Fabric provides is the ability to provide that data, provision the data, as you mentioned, Eric, much more faster with fewer resources, and enable the business users to react faster, like in the case of Ultramobile.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And what's kind of interesting is what goes around comes around, right? And we do have these cycles in the business world where we're all about unification, then we're about federation, then unification or centralization, federation. But we saw that even with the data lake, because here we had a data warehouse, and the vision was to pull all this data from all these different sources, like your ERP systems, your clickstream, whatever it is, pull it all in, stick it in a big honking relational database like a Teradata, for example, or some of these other guys. Now, of course, Snowflake. And then it was like, well, maybe that's not the best way. Data virtualization came around. And then what happened? Then the data lake. Well, what is the data lake? It's a giant centralized repository. So it's the same idea kind of came back. And I think we learned some lessons along the way, but I think what you're talking about here, Ravi, with respect to this logical data fabric is, folks, what you need to do is cater to the business needs. Whatever the business needs right now, that's where you should be focusing your attention. And to Christopher's point, if you have this fabric approach, you're going to be able to provision the insights, the data, the analysis necessary for your sales team, for your marketing team, for your R&D folks, without having to try to cater to be-all, end-all type solution styles like a giant data lake. Data lakes are great, don't get me wrong. But my point is that to cater to the business, that's when you really want to be using this approach, because it allows you to iterate quickly and it allows you to get the data that they're going to need to make those decisions. What do you think, Ravi?
Yeah, exactly. And data lakes, again, going back to the Gartner, there are a couple of people to quote. One is Nick Hudecker, who is an ex-analyst at Gartner. He kind of did some survey, and he said that about 84% of the data lakes basically did not go into production because of the complexity involved in bringing all the data into a single place and using it as the analytical engine. So that did not really work out. And to quote another analyst, Henry Cook, you talked about like the circle and going into centralization, decentralization. So right. He actually created a diagram in 2018 in which he talked about the data warehouses, pre-data warehouse, all multiple different databases coming into a central place, into a data warehouse, and then kind of going back into a decentralization with the data lakes and the data warehouse. And he says it's time to stop collecting the information. The moment I have a postulation where the speed at which we can physically aggregate the data far exceeds the human ability to be able to pull them all in a central place. So I think we should be looking at the logical aspect more than the physical aspect of it.
No, that's an excellent point. We'll pick that up after the break too, folks, as well. Send me an email, folks, info@dmradio.biz. We'll be right back. You are listening to DM Radio.
Welcome back to DM Radio. Here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
All right, folks, welcome back to DM Radio. Once again, roundtable discussion is upon us. We're talking to several great experts today on the show. Sanjeev Mohan, Industry Analyst, Ravi Shankar of Denodo Technologies, and Christopher G. of Mint Mobile, owned by Ryan Reynolds. I love that guy. He's freaking genius. I can't even believe how smart that guy is. He's off the charts. But so we're talking about data and data provisioning and data virtualization and ownership. We had a great question from our studio audience. Ravi, I'll throw it over to you. How do you handle data ownership in a virtualized world?
So the data ownership belongs to the lines of businesses that author the particular data. So the data mesh subscribes to that particular principle, and data virtualization is a great way to have data mesh implemented within an organization. So the owners of the data know about the data, they create the data. We talked about data as a product, and then they can make it available to others to be able to use it. So the data ownership belongs to the different lines of businesses. But from a consumption perspective, it is important that we consume multiple different data. So if you're a customer service rep, you want to understand which customers bought what products through which channels. Do they have service agreements? Do they have warranties and so on? So you need this unified information that can come from different lines of businesses and data owners, but we provision that using a logical layer like data virtualization so that the business users can have this unified view of the information at their tips.
Yeah, that's very cool. And you brought up another excellent point, right? Which is you're going to learn in the business over time that different groups are going to want different data sets, different pieces of data, different insights. And again, if you have a sort of marshaling area, which is this this logical data fabric, it's easier for people to find those little bits and pieces and then incorporate them into what they're working with. Because as you're trying to analyze some market trend or try to make a decision on which products to sell in which market at which time, there are so many different sources that you can go to get information. But to be able to pull it quickly and then run the numbers, do that iteration, do that testing, well, if we could sell this many at that price point, how much? That's the kind of technology that can really help you at least make informed decisions on which direction to go. It may still not work out for you, but at least you had some method to your madness in getting there. And then we also had a great question from the audience about governance. And I'll mention that since my beginnings in this career, in this industry, I thought to myself, governance isn't, you could do governance at the database access layer, or you could do governance perhaps at the app access layer, but that requires very manual issuing of credentials and management of credentials and passwords and all that stuff. And you start to get to a big organization, that gets extremely difficult to manage. I mean, it would be a full-time job just to do that. And it's not a very valuable job. So what happens with data governance is if you do have this abstraction layer through which a lot of the important data goes, now you can control those access points and you have actual data governance. Christopher G., what do you think about that?
You spoke about it very well, Eric. And, tagging on what Robbie said earlier about data ownership, I'm talking about data usage. You may own the data, but who gets to use the data, right? So now we're talking about governance. So you may have all these access rights, permissions, what you should be able to provision. How do you provision it down into one of these operational systems? That's a lot of systems to be provisioning to. How do you keep that all straight? Right. If we're talking about access to the data, we provision it through our data fabric. Right. We need to control and comply those governance rules there. It's important to protect financial data. People talk about that. It's important, sure. PII data, personal identifiable information, even more, in some cases, more important. So we can protect that too. What types of data, who should see it, and how much should they see? Should it be encrypted? Should it be obfuscated? What should it be? And how are they using this data? Is it through reporting? Is it through an application? Or are they actually querying the data? We can address those types of use cases because we have this data fabricating type of technology we're using. So,
and you can also, I'm sure you can also learn a lot about who's using what, because again, I've seen these reports, I've seen demos of all kinds of different technologies over the years. And for those in the data industry, if you're at a pretty large organization, you're going to have thousands, if not tens of thousands of reports, all kinds of source systems that you can tap into, but being able to meaningfully get to them quickly and understand something about them, that's a difficult thing to do unless you have a program like this where your logical data fabric is the mechanism by which you deliver data for these analytical use cases. Now you have a mechanism to track all this stuff, to understand usage patterns, and then, of course, to be able to kind of figure out some ROI at some point in time. Is this really working? The more you can the more you can trace the whole process from start to finish, the better off you're going to be explaining to your senior executives or your board members or even your customers or investors of why you have to do this and what the value is. And that's a big part of the equation, because if you can't tell the story, you're not going to get the financing, you're not going to get the help, you're not going to energize the team. Morale is a big part of this too. And if you have all these things in place, man, people get excited. And once you open those doors, they start doing all kind of fun things. I'll throw that over to Sanjeev. There's this real fascinating kinetic nature to thought processes and to the camaraderie that generates out of coming up with new ideas and then seeing them go into action. And that's one of the sort of big perks down the road of going down this path. What do you think, Sanjeev?
Eric, before you go to Sanjeev, like just to close on this topic of data governance.
Yeah.
So, the key point like that you made and Chris made, we've been talking about like enterprise data governance for a long time, which has never been operationalized. What we have had is an application level data governance, like data warehouse has a governance, MDM has a governance, and so on. So with the data fabric being the unifying layer across all of the data, now you have a chance to a shot at the enterprise data governance using the data fabric approach.
Yeah. No, that's an excellent point. That's exactly right. Sanjeev, do you want to jump on that?
Yeah. So we have a bunch of questions on this topic. Data governance is such an important point. And what you were alluding to, generation of new ideas and new use cases is a very important collaboration piece, which I want to talk about for just a couple of minutes. So we on this call, we spent a lot of time talking about the virtualization piece. So virtualization piece is a low level, bringing data from different places. But as we move up the ladder, once we virtualize, then we can extract metadata, understand the semantics, and create a knowledge graph. So we haven't talked about knowledge graph. So knowledge graph becomes one of the important bedrocks of how we are going to consume data. So you've got the knowledge graph, and then you have a data catalog. Data catalog is where you discover your business terms, and they are mapped to the source, the technical metadata. And then on top, you have data access governance, where you've got consistent policies being executed, and only users are allowed to see only what they're authorized to see, and nothing else. So that is happening sort of in real time. I may execute a query, Ravi executes a different, same one, Christopher executes, and we may see slightly different results because of this different policies being applied because we belong to different organizations. So to me, that is the top half of a data fabric, which with a knowledge graph, a data catalog, and a data access governance layer. With collaboration, so when you have a catalog, I can go in, Ravi, Christopher, we can all look at, we can annotate, we can certify, like Christopher said, they're already doing that. So if I'm a consumer, what does a consumer do today? What does a data scientist do? They spend 80% of their time just trying to understand the data and munching the data and getting it ready. Well, if I know it's certified, I can go do what I've been hired to do, which is train my models, rather than trying to second guess, is this data to be trusted? Is this the right data? Let data fabric handle that and show to you what the right data is.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. And what Sanjeev is really leaning into here is this whole concept of trust. When people believe in the data, they're going to use the data. And that it's a very nebulous thing trying to ascertain who doesn't trust the data, but you can see it in the numbers when people use it or they don't use it. You can see it in the access reports. So is this report being used? How many people are using it? Who's using it? So there are ways to do that, and it's important to do that, right? Because that's a critical part of what we're doing here. Final thoughts before our podcast bonus segment. I'll throw it over real quick. 1 minute, Ravi Shankar. Closing thoughts from you on the importance of a logical data fabric.
So the logical data fabric is a very important concept within the framework of data fabric to unify the information across multiple different systems, manage it centrally from a governance perspective, security perspective, and make the data provisioned or delivered to the business users in real time, instantaneously. The contrary, the physical approach basically slows you down in trying to get the data into a central place. And we are fighting gravity at that particular point. So a logical data fabric is a much better approach, in my opinion.
That is a very succinct answer to a very complex question. We got the podcast bonus section coming up next, but look these folks up online, my friends. Look up Christopher G. from Mint Mobile or Ultra Mobile, Ravi Shankar of Denodo Technologies, Sanjeev Mohan of SanjMo, who I think will be going to a Gartner conference here pretty soon, but if not, come to New York. We'll be showing up at a conference ourselves, and we'll be right back with the podcast bonus.
In the know, I'm Mariah Haberman for Dairy Farmers.